So when Digital Earth Africa was launched just over 5 years ago, it set out with an ambitious goal to make Earth observation data accessible and useful to all Africans. Since then, it has exceeded expectations, supporting real-world impact, influencing policy making, and empowering governments, scientists, and communities across the continent with powerful environmental and socio-economic insights. With the support from the Helmsley Charitable Trust and other global partners, DE Africa is now entering its next phase of growth. Talking to me about the next phase is the Acting Managing Director of Digital Earth Africa, Dr. Lisa-Maria Rebelo. Doctor, good morning and thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Doc, let's go back to the bold vision of 2019, right? Let's talk about what that vision was. And now we're talking about the next phase. But take us back to the early days around the formation of the program. What did you know then that now in hindsight obviously is a 2020 vision, but back then it was really a simple task, or was it a mammoth task?
I would say it was a mammoth task. So 5 years ago, we were in the situation where we have the major space agencies around the world, the US and the European space agencies in particular, who are providing data of our land surfaces, our seas, our coastlines for free, so at no cost. And yet we have the situation across much of the African continent that these data aren't being used. We see them being used elsewhere, but we don't see them being exploited to their full potential across our continent. And so that's really what led to the vision for Digital Earth Africa, was looking at the why. Why is that the case? Why are these data that are freely available not actually being used and exploited to their full potential? And the reason for that was a simple one of accessibility, and really getting to the crux of it was that just because these data are freely and openly available doesn't mean they're universally accessible. And so that was the vision that we started with Digital Earth Africa, was how do we make these already free and open data sets actually accessible to our users across the African continent.
And it's so interesting that you talk about that the data doc, it's sitting there, it's free, it's available, and yet on the African continent there is this, one could argue lack of resources, maybe lack of understanding in terms of the work data does for you. When you started engaging and you started deep diving, was it as simple as just an issue of accessibility, or was it an issue that, governments, especially on the continent of Africa, fluctuate wildly in terms of who's in and who's stepping into that role? Some leadership have deep appreciation for data and what it can do. Others not so much, depending on what the agenda is. And then how does one then work your way through that and then start educating and start advocating for the use of data?
Yes, that's a really interesting point, because yes, institutional changes, obviously, and political changes and priorities, they will continue. That's something that's not going to change. But taking a step sideways and saying, yes, while the governments are key users, we also have a wide range of other potential users. So whether it's the private sector, whether it's the communities, whether it's the universities. And so looking more broadly at what that accessibility challenge is, it was really, for us, it was one of infrastructure and one of capacity. So infrastructure, in that accessing these data sets, even though they're free and open, pulling them across the seas, as it were, from the US, from European archives to our African countries, is still a challenge. And so we address that by working with Amazon Web Services, bringing the data, hosting them in Cape Town, so that they're actually hosted on the continent now, which addresses some of that accessibility challenge. They're all hosted on the cloud out of Cape Town. But we also then address the capacity. Sorry, did you want to step in?
No, Doc, I just wanted to commend that, because I think that is such an important move for the data to be hosted on the African continent, in a place like Cape Town. And I think that in itself is a game changer as opposed to on another continent.
Yeah, and then I think that really speaks to what we're trying to do as a program. So when we say Digital Earth Africa is African owned and African led, that's really what it speaks to, is the data are on the continent. The continent has ownership of those, even though the data themselves are not produced initially on the continent. Because what we also do in speaking to that is part of that challenge of accessibility is that these are massive, massive data sets. And while users might be able to download one image for one day onto a laptop or a desktop, we're talking about a 40-year archive for the entire continent of images that are updated every 2 to 3 days in some locations, a bit longer in others. And so it's massive, massive data sets. And so what we do is not only make them available, but make them available in an analysis-ready format, which means that our users don't have to do all of the organizing, all of the finding the bits that, looking at data quality, etc. So it means it's much easier to just do the analysis. And so I think that's the infrastructure component that we addressed. And then alongside that, it's coming back to that point on capacity. We really saw that 5 years ago, a big challenge in exploiting the use of these data was to do with a lack of capacity. And so a big emphasis of the program is freely available capacity building modules, online training courses, self-paced courses, that enable our users to really understand how and where they can access and use the data.
And I would also imagine then, Doc, that if we are collaborating in such a way that Africa in many ways doesn't have to make the mistakes that its counterparts have made over the years, because we are learning in real time. You're talking about self-paced education, self-assessment, all of these kind of things, and I wonder how you think then that plays into truly empowering Africa through data, because we don't have to make the same mistakes. We can learn from our partners.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to that. And the first is definitely, the type of infrastructure that we implement here is called the Open Data Cube. And Digital Earth Africa is by no means the only one, although it is now the largest global implementation, which for me is also a really exciting thing. We really are leading the way as the African continent, leading the way in this, which is hugely exciting. But we also have other digital Earths that use the same infrastructure. So, for example, there's a Brazilian data cube, there's an Australian data cube, there's a Pacific data cube. And what that means is we have shared learning, shared analytics, shared workflows. So we can already exploit and leverage the developments elsewhere and then contextualize them for the African continent and for our users. So I think that definitely goes a big way to empowering and enabling us to just move forward faster.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a lot of the advocacy work that's still left for organizations like yourself, even though you've got 30,000 users that's currently engaging with the platform. But talk to me about how DEA, how Digital Earth Africa has actually been able to influence the data in terms of decision making, how it's been able to improve lives. Work, for example, that you've done in Ghana or Nigeria.
Yes, so we have various different applications that we develop and then we work with our users to develop themselves. And I think this is really where we see the power of the platform. So, for example, we have users in Ghana who've developed approaches to look at coastal erosion as a result, resulting in saltwater intrusion, affecting the quality of groundwater, for example, and affecting the communities, resulting in decreased livelihoods and food insecurity. And so working with the national disaster management organizations and others, we have users who've developed approaches to identify where this is occurring and take actions. But the exciting thing about this is an application developed in Ghana, but because we have a scalable platform for the entire continent, a user elsewhere in any other African country can take that application and just implement it for their country. To produce similar outputs and inform action around similar activities. And to me, I think that's really what the power is. And when we talk about impact, that's the huge impact of the program, is this ability to scale and look at applications developed in one location and transferring them to another. And maybe just to give you...
Please go ahead.
I was just going to give you an example of one, the context, I guess, is closer to home for you and some of your listeners. So we've been working over the last few weeks with the city of Johannesburg, providing on-the-job training to support different departments and ultimately to address urban management of Johannesburg. And this came out of approaches that were developed initially with North African countries for local governments to look at how to improve urban resilience. And based on that, we developed a suite of tools around urban change and the management of green spaces. And this was in partnership with the Sahel and West Africa Club of the OECD. And recently transferring those to on-the-job training for the city of Johannesburg to see how they can be implemented to look at urban resilience across the city.
And then, of course, I think the other big announcement on the back of why we're talking to you is the fact that the Helmsley Charitable Trust has extended its funding. And what does that mean for an organization like yourself, Doc?
So it gives us the space over the next few years to really try and cement what we're doing to continue to build our impact, but also to look at what that means for the sustainment of the program, to look at how we build it out into something that isn't dependent purely on donor funding, but is actually able to sustain itself going forward through different mechanisms. And part of that means, of course, it's dependent on the infrastructure that we've been building, the data streams and the applications, but part of it is also building out that user community and demonstrating what the impact really is across sectors and across users. So for us, it's a hugely exciting time because it means we have this extended window to really cement the work that's been done over the past 5 years.
Yeah, and I mean, it's always amazing when you read about these partnerships, because then you think about, I mean, you've highlighted some of the elements that will be impacted by it, but it also allows you, I mean, over the last 5 years, you've collaborated with over 100 government departments and institutions across the continent. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, and when you build relationships like this with Helmsley, it helps that. It takes the pressure off a little.
Yes, it definitely does. It's a big job we have cut out for ourselves, not just working with one country, but really supporting as many African countries as possible with a full continental scale infrastructure and data. And so, the more support and input we have into doing that, the more successful and the bigger the impact is going to be.
Yeah, I think some of the other elements as well, and I wonder if you agree with me. Some of the other elements as well that DA impacts is, for example, women in STEM and leadership. The idea that we can then merge science, technology, and policy. How do you see the work that DA Africa has done in encouraging women and young people to pursue careers in geospatial sciences or data analysis?
Yeah, so this is an aspect that's obviously very close to my heart and also a core theme for our program. And we're very, very strong on supporting our diversity inclusion and particularly our young women in the geospatial sector, as well as youth. And so we work through programs of challenges, of mentorship, and maybe just to highlight one. For example, we work with Youth Mappers chapters around the continent. Youth Mappers is a global network of university students who both create and use geospatial data to address real-world challenges in their communities. And by doing so, improve community resilience. And they often work in partnership with local organizations, governments, in their locations. And so we've worked with the Youth Mappers chapter from the University of Pretoria, for example, to build their capacity and understanding of how to use Digital Earth Africa to address some of the challenges that they see in their communities, how to access the data and how to develop applications.
Doc, a little bit earlier you talked about that a fair amount of the imaging and the content that's developed by DE Africa is not produced in South Africa. How do we change that? Because I think, or maybe I'm being silly, but I'm wondering whether the capacity to produce, to contribute, and not just consume, whether that changes the way we are seen in the global context. An interesting fact that I read yesterday was that, for example, South Africa is one of the few countries in the world who has a research facility in Antarctica. And that's why South Africa is such a big voice when it comes to issues pertaining to that part of the world or research. In your mind, if we become a contributor to, does that change the way we are seen?
Yes, and sorry, that might have been a misrepresentation from my part, but South Africa is definitely a key producer of geospatial information, not only a consumer. So, um, in terms of the sources of data, what I was referring to was really the satellites that produce
Hmm.
or make available the free kind of what we refer to as medium spatial resolution. So you can use it for a range of land surface applications, but it's not the very, very high resolution commercial data, for example, which you need to purchase and goes down to really the finest of details, buildings, etc. And so we have various countries around the continent who actually have launched and have their own different levels of maturity space programs producing data themselves. So that was on the data production side, on the actual raw, the satellite data itself. But South Africa is not only a consumer of that data, but also a producer of different applications. And certainly, for Digital Earth Africa, our program management office is hosted by the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability in Johannesburg. And we work closely with various partners across the country to produce data. So all of the then what we refer to as our decision-ready products, which are the thematic outputs, whether that's looking at the presence and the absence of water, whether that's looking at agriculture, whether that's looking at coastline change, we actually produce those on the continent. And that's really what we're trying to shift with Digital Earth Africa, is changing the continent from being purely a consumer of data to being a producer.
Yeah, and as we wrap up this conversation, I've got to ask you, Doc, and I don't know how you. I sometimes think it's a bit of a gotcha question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Just in terms of the future of Earth observation in Africa, if you had to kind of paint a picture for us with that insight 10 years from now, what would that look like?
So I would like maybe it's two different things. What I would like to see and yeah, where we'll be, but the direction, the trajectory we're going at the moment is really a very exciting one. We see programs such as Digital Earth Africa really driving this development, pushing this technology on the continent, and with Africa really leading the way in implementation. And in parallel to that, from the producer side of the data itself, the satellite side, we had spoken to that briefly just previously. We had a really exciting event last week at the New Space Africa conference in Cairo with the launch of the African Space Agency. And so, with developments such as these, I would hope that within the next 10 years, we really see a very different participation of African countries and Africa itself in the space sector, both as not moving away very much from that consumer only to really being a key player in the producer side of it as well.
Dr. Lisa, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. Have a good day.
Yeah, that's Dr. Lisa-Maria Rebelo, who's the acting managing director of Digital Earth Africa, sharing the journey with us this far in terms of just how data is reshaping Africa's future. And obviously, as I mentioned, she represents Digital Earth Africa, and they were launched just over 5 years ago, and it was to set out with this ambitious goal to make Earth observation data accessible and useful to all Africans. Of course, since then, it's exceeded expectations, supporting real-world impact, influencing policy making, and empowering governments, scientists, and communities across the continent with powerful environmental and socio-economic insights. And as you've heard from Dr. Lisa, South Africa is a producer of that data.